Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right. Well, poet and novelist Katherena Vermette's latest book is Procession. She joins me on the program to talk about it. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Do you make a distinction? I realize in introducing you as like poet and novelist, like, are you writer? What would you describe yourself as?
Honestly, I say writer just because author implies an authority that I don't think I have. And everything else seems kind of incomplete because I kind of go all over the place. So yeah, I stick with writer.
Right, that it doesn't draw distinction or schism between different types of work.
Exactly. Well, to be fair, I answer to anything. I do think I'm a poet. I try to be a novelist. Occasionally, graphic novelist is fun because I write a series of graphic novels for kids, and it really pumped up my cool factor with them. But yeah, I go where the story goes, right?
I totally get that. I did want to ask you, so usually I start with either the acknowledgments or the notes because I find there's a lot of the clues, but I was very curious about kind of the back of the book and whether you wrote the copy for the back of the book or not.
I didn't. That would have been Kevin, my editor. I think with the help of Emma, my publicist, I did talk about I did pass on it. Like I did get, yes, I approve this message, but I have to say a lot of the marketing stuff around my books, I really defer to people who know better.
Yeah, like obviously there's like a definition of procession that starts the description. I was wondering if that was kind of coming out of you or if that was someone else seeing what this was and what kind of like decision making goes into describing a book to catch people or draw them in.
Yeah, I mean, the final say of the back copy always goes to the marketing people and the publicity people, and it's really about like positioning in that way, in that market kind of way. I do think the definition of the procession came from a conversation between Kevin and I, because really talking about whether or not Procession was going to be the title, because it is the title of one poem in the book. And I wasn't sure if that was the title, and we weren't sure. I always kind of decide my titles at the end. It did feel like I was really attracted to the word as far as the idea of process and how we're not only in like a life process, but we're in a generational process, and how procession as a word is kind of fabulous in the way that it's everything, right? It's a graduation procession, it's a wedding procession, it's a funeral procession. It's like, I mean, I'm sure there's some sort of birth procession of some kind somewhere. It always seems like at our big moments, we have this moving forward in a line. Which we are doing all the time, generationally. We're always kind of moving one after the other, which kind of really suited the theme of the book a lot more than anything else, I think.
Yeah, labor proceeds, right? Like there's stages in,
yeah.
Like when you're a certain dilation and things like that, there is a procession
to
these things.
Okay, yeah. I was thinking like some sort of parade.
I mean, you take the kid out afterwards and obviously, you're like, hey, bring them around to the relatives and things.
Yeah. I mean, the birthing person shouldn't have to walk, but I think everyone around them should be like, hooting and hollering and, throwing confetti.
100%. You said the magic word for me, which is process. I'm always fascinated with process around creation. And I maybe kind of want to unpack the process of this book because parts of this appeared previously, like in other works. Is that right?
For sure. And quite a while ago too, I one of the poems about there's many parts to the book. I love parts in my poetry books. There was a whole section that was written when my daughter was born. My daughter was born in 2017, and a whole section of that was published in Room magazine around 2018 or so. Also, that was the same kind of year I started the photography kind of poems. Another section of the book is photography, old pictures, kind of, and it was from a time when my uncle was still around, and he had gathered this beautiful collection of old family photos. Like, there's a tin print in there from the 1850s old, lots of stuff from the 1920s. And I was fascinated by these photos, not only of my own immediate family and folks that I remembered, like from in the 50s and 60s, but just our ancestors, pictures I think that I could have never hoped to know what their faces looked like. And I got to. So a lot of those poems really started and were published elsewhere and just kind of grew from that. Like as poetry does, it tends to start with a poem and then it becomes many poems. And then if you're like me and you hit a metaphor that you or a theme that you really love, you just go, you keep creating more and more for the collection of them.
Is there like a certain like aha moment where you realize you're kind of circling around one type of theme and that like this is kind of something around which things can coalesce?
Yeah, it tends to, what I write about it's not exactly like a magic aha moment as it is, I really like it and I want to keep going. I kind of tend to get obsessions around themes or patterns. There's one section in the book where I'm really exploring Michif and Anishinaabe words, and really it's actually a poetry practice that Mary Dalton, the Newfoundland poet Mary Dalton, did. It's kind of like a guessing game where the poem describes the word, but you don't quite know what that word is. So I did that for language, right? So I didn't want to define the word all the time. As I'm learning these languages, I really get tired of always having to translate them because I want to know them. I want everyone to know them a lot more intimately. So I was writing these poems that instead of translating the word, I'm describing the word in a poem. So I really loved that as an idea. And I just kept finding new words that I wanted to do that with. And then I grow tired of it and move on to the next thing, the next shiny thing, as I want to do.
The work of translation and learning another language and bringing that in, do you find then that writing around the word rather than giving a clinical description gets to a deeper meaning of that word?
It's an attempt at a deeper meaning, or maybe it's a deeper meaning, like a deeper personal meaning, because I think these poems, I think if you took these words, and they're quite like everyday words. So there's a bindigan, which means welcome. There's tanshikia, which is hello, how are you? Or anin, which is another greeting word. So it's really greeting words, and they're words that are becoming more and more familiar to more and more folks as we reclaim these languages. But I think that's like everybody would write a different poem about that word, a different meaning that they would have. So it's very personal meaning. It's kind of my learning of the word and my interpretation of the word, and it feels very singular and individual in that way. And yeah, it would be then inviting other people to have their own relationship with that word. You know what I mean?
So like an understanding rather than a meaning in some sense?
I would think so, yeah. And well, poetry is always just an interpretation of something, right? Everyone can, just like anybody, just like any kind of writing, any kind of art is that interpretation. So many different people can experience the exact same singular event and have a different interpretation of it. So it's really just my own.
You mentioned Mary Dalton, and you do credit her in the acknowledgments. Had you read her work, or is this something that you learned from her? I'm curious about kind of like how that came to be.
No, I had seen her years ago. We were at a poetry festival together and she performed some of those poems. It was a small town poetry festival in Ontario. I'm trying to remember the name of it and I cannot. But I was just blown away by just the play of these poems, the audience interaction with her. And I just really grew excited about that as a way to practice poems. I know it's something that she taught for years in her classes, that different kind of style of poems, and or poetry as kind of like a describing something, and then you later guess what it becomes known what you're describing. I think one of her poems was about an apple. And I just remember this beautiful retelling and description of an apple, but she never says the word apple. And it was just such a different way of playing with poetry that I think one is a beautiful teaching tool. And I have used it in writing classes since, but also it was something I wanted to play specifically here with language, but just fun, just games.
Is poetry always play to you, or does it ever become work, or like what's your kind of relationship to it?
Oh, that's a good question. I like that question. I think that writing in general, poetry specifically, it is play. But it is play in that way that, play, it's not always fun. Sometimes it's really unpacking something pretty, at best, meaningful. Sometimes, I've used my work to unpack trauma. sometimes more often than not, maybe more often than I intended to. But it's play in the way that it's what's the word? It's interactive, it's kinetic, it feels so very visceral to kind of go in and write about something. I used to say when I was a kid that I often didn't know what I was feeling until I would write it in my journal and then read it back to myself. You know, there's some sort of unconsciousness that comes out when you're writing and you just let yourself write. That kind of surprises you. And in that way, it is play. And in that way, it kind of takes something like literally out of you and onto the page, and it becomes something different. And in that way, it's always fascinating. So even when it is traumatic, it becomes maybe safe, maybe play. Though play seems a little more of a lighter word than some of the stuff that I do.
It sounds like maybe, and just thinking about this from my own like experience with play, like you're kind of immersed in something, and you're not necessarily consciously thinking about what you're doing. That
Yeah.
you're just kind of like the body is doing it, or like kind of like the deeper mind is doing it, and not the like kind of like the eyes on your shoulder kind of looking at what you're doing.
Yeah, there's no like nothing is being dictated. You're not recording something and trying to, yeah, there is an unconsciousness to it. Definitely an immersion, definitely a physical thing. Like I do, especially with poetry. I do write. I'm not so old that I don't write. I write many things on my laptop, but poetry is one of those things that I feel like I always want to write it on the page first. I want to have that like physical pen to paper interaction with it first. And it is like play is learning. You know, play is how we all learn, no matter what age we are, but particularly when we first start learning as children. Like we're experiencing the world. We're literally, trying to be tactile and touch it and figure it out. So in that way, yeah, it is play. It's definitely learning. It is definitely a learning for me, though I don't think writing or poetry should be necessarily educational for the reader, though we all learn. This is how we learn through art, we learn through writing, and we learn through poetry definitely is taught me I think everything I've learned from books. But it is like it's not didactic, it's just emotional and mental and physical experiences of the world through other people's eyes.
You said there it shouldn't necessarily be educational for the reader. Do you think about what a thing should be for the reader?
Um, I think it should be a story. And I say that in like, I know I don't try to be deliberately educational. I don't want to teach people things, but I also make just completely contradict myself. I also know that we learn things from story, but I think first and foremost, story and poetry should be story and poetry. It shouldn't be trying to tell you something. A poem is supposed to describe something or describe an experience and an immersive experience. I really love, the very minimalist kind of poem and poetic traditions where you're almost painting on the page rather than more than anything else. You're using as few words as possible and to try to either describe a feeling or an image or whatever you have. That's kind of where I like to stay with poetry and same with story. I mean, I do try to use as few words as possible and sometimes get way too wordy, but at the most it has to be a story. It has to be a poem. And what you learn from it is secondary and almost unintentional because once you write it and put it out into the world, you have absolutely no control over how it's going to be received and what people are going to get from it. And arguably, we all just, what is it? We experiencing the world as we are, not how it actually is. So what people get from your work is going to be based on what their own experiences are with whatever you're writing about. So there is no control there. So I really try to think about my audience or anyone who's going to read what I write only in terms of, if I'm writing about like I write about specific kind of people sometimes. And like in this book, I was writing about my family. So I was really conscious of my family and what they would think of these books or these poems. I wrote a poem there called Grin about my uncle. And I really wanted to make sure his children knew about that and were okay about that. I thought of what they would think of it. I wrote about my Mennonite grandmothers. So I definitely was thinking about my family there, and not necessarily for their approval, because I don't know that you necessarily always get that, but at least being true to the story and being respectful to the story. I was very conscious of that.
It's so funny here you say we meet a book where we are and like bring our subjectivity to it. I was thinking about that when you write in the book about like photographs and the like matriarchal like photo albums put together and preserving things. I had the experience this summer. My mother had brought out old photo albums and my kids were not interested in looking at them with her. And I know she listens to this show, so I want to apologize to her for like not engaging with that matriarchal work. But it's interesting to hear you say it was your uncle who had the photos and that, kind of prompted this exploration of the photos that kind of play into these poems and just kind of like the preservation of the past and the way we interpret it is something that, is recurrent within Procession.
Mm-hmm. I mean, all of the stories seem to take on that centralness of me, and it was me experiencing not only the birth of my children, but also the death of many loved ones, and just kind of constantly feeling in this in-between space of what comes next and what has come before us. The pictures were incredibly telling of that, and if not the birth, if you will, of kind of the themes around the poems. My uncle was the keeper of the great box of photos. The photos describe, I can't believe your children weren't interested in them. They will be one day, I'm sure, because I think old photos just hold so much in them. Like these people for me, I remember I keep thinking of this one photo where it's this gentleman. He's dressed up, they're dressed in their Sunday best, and it was a very 1920s type of costume or clothing with the armbands and the high collars. But he looked like me, and it was such a weird kind of relationship I had with this human that no one even remembered what his name was, because these photos came from many different places and many different parts of the family. But I had a connection to him, that was, over 100 years old, and that is very much the same through the pictures of my family and the photos of my family. And part of that matriarchal kind of curating that happened because and I credit Dr. Susan Close for this, and she wrote a book called Framing Identity about the feminist women photographers kind of developing an image of what we now know as Canada. And that's definitely something that happened within families, because in families the photographer more often than not was the mother, and how the mother framed their family went on to frame how their family was viewed and how their family was remembered. And in this context, it's also how our community and how our nations are remembered. So my grandmother was in charge of decades of story that she created through these images she had of her children and her husband and her family and her home, that really spoke of a time and a people, the Michif people, in and around what is now called Winnipeg, that was really important, really sacred. And I'm so glad we have these photos. They were in my uncle's possession, and now his eldest daughter is the keeper of these photos. And I just think they're just absolute treasures that my children will hopefully be interested in one day, as I continue to be.
Yeah, not to throw my children under the bus. They just wanted to go swimming.
I get it. I don't mean they will like it. They will be glad of them one day.
For sure. You mentioned before about, thinking about it as painting, right? That like poetry as painting. You had said that you like to write it out with the pen. Is that in part because that allows you to kind of put the words on a page in a visual sense as well? Like a layout can be part of that in a way that's probably easier than like writing on the computer?
I think so. It's so much, well, poetry really depends on the whiteness of the page, right? Depending on how your line breaks, and you can play with that in different ways. And that's a whole lot easier to figure out and draw, if you will, on the written page with a pen. There's a lot more freedom in being able to cross out things and kind of picture it. And then I do bring it, of course, to the computer afterwards and play with spacing and stuff. But it almost feels more awkward than when you're able to just do it with the pen on the page. But yeah, it is such a visual medium as much as I think it's essential to hear poems read out loud. But it's also, yeah, poetry books are so brilliant in how you can interact with the images inside of them.
Speaking of images, obviously, like photographs, the photographs like that your uncle had is one thing, but there are poems about like the mechanics of taking photographs, like aperture and things like that. Like, are you a photographer?
No, I don't. I'm not much of anything besides a writer, but I just like to obsess about these things. I would love to get into photography, but I'm a better writer of photography than I am a photographer. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So then those poems specifically around kind of like the mechanics of photography, how did those ones come about?
That was just studying the art of photography and really thinking about these photos and really from the grandmother's perspective, because she had all these photos and all these old kind of cameras, and just thinking of what she would have to know in order to operate these cameras, which are like she had, she was taking photos in the 1930s. So she had these really old kind of cameras that seem so complicated to us now. I had originally thought of how like because when I had my first children, I have older children in their 20s, and originally when they were born, we had film cameras. And now my children are now, very young. And I've never taken a photo of them that hasn't been on my phone, so it's a very different things that we are learning in order to capture these moments. And my grandmother had to have all this technical knowledge in order to like literally roll out these old photographs. So I was just thinking about the different aspects of photography that she considered that I'd never have to consider because my technology does it all for me, or can anyway. Um, and really those brilliant words of things we consider in photography, which are the same in many ways of what we consider in poetry. I'm talking about white space. I'm talking about these beautiful words like exposure, or framing, narrowing, zooming in on the page. Little words like that, just how we're constantly doing that in poetry and photography.
It's interesting to think, particularly about like contemporary photography versus like older photography. Like the process that it took to do that was so arduous. Like every photograph kind of meant something, whereas now like people take like 8 or 9 shots and discard a whole bunch.
Yeah, and it almost seems like I always feel like I have so many photos. It almost feels like I have like this like this technological clutter that's always happening. Whereas I remember, again, even as a kid, like I'm thinking in the 80s and 90s, or in the 90s when I started taking photos, every photo was precious, right? As and you didn't even know what it looked like until you later got it developed and printed. And it was always a surprise. And it was usually always a goof, right? And if you totally goofed on a photo, that's money, that's printing, that's waiting and not knowing until the end that that photo didn't turn out the way you wanted it to. Like it's such a vastly different experience than now, where you take like a billion pictures and you always have one, you have more than you need.
Yeah, it makes me think of like kind of like the value we place on things, and then like the like change, like we still obviously value photos, and this is not to go back to my kids, but like they still are like I if I'm gonna post a photo of them, they want it to be a good photo of them.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I get that.
like we have a weird relationship with photography and kind of where it goes and how it disappears versus like that shoebox of photos that like is concrete and
Yep.
it makes me think of kind of the procession of time and that this book, like you're thinking about yourself as like a young person exploring writing in a couple of the poems, and like that your personality was there and it's etched in some way, in the same way that like a permanent photo, a physical photo, whereas like it's a little more ethereal or like slippery now.
It is. And it also, like, there's something about things that are in physical form, like writing a book or having the photographs, or like that make you feel like they're closer to a heartbeat than it is like the in this technology that just always seems fleeting. And any moment now the cloud can disappear and all the photos will be lost. Or maybe that's just my weird ongoing fear. I have to somehow have these tangible memories and these printed photos in order for them to be like substantial. But I think it's just a different relationship with the same, like the same gesture of wanting to capture and kind of like keep a little bit. Like these photos are always just memories, writings are always just memories of a moment that's almost like it is fleeting. They're all fleeting. But you're trying to like pause them in some way. And I mean, it's the same gesture that's happening. The photos we take of our kids now are the same as when our grandmothers were taking photos of their kids, right? They just want to capture that so that because it's going to pass so quickly. And aren't we so lucky to have any photos um, of when they were not quite as they look now, maybe a little bit cuter, maybe a little bit more goofier, or maybe just younger. Like we're so lucky to have anything. We're so lucky to have all these photos cluttering up our devices.
In the same way that we're lucky to have like these memories and these lines that connect us to our ancestors.
I think so. I think everyone is so like we all come from such rich story. We come from people who fought like hell to get us to where we are. To have, aren't, people who feel so lucky to have grandchildren and great grandchildren continuing on their stories. And we will be that person one day too. I mean, like in this moment, particularly, I would be so delighted if I have great grandchildren, still living on this earth and hopefully, safe and warm and healthy and well fed. Because we're always living in some, you know, and we're always living in our time, this particular time being quite acute and crisis like. So we're just kind of, hoping for the best, hoping those who come after us have to suffer a little bit less.
That's hope is definitely a thread within this book that like you draw on past hopes of grandmothers, and you draw on the hopes of who you were as a younger person, and for the most part you wish well of all the people who come forward, right? That's one of the through lines.
I hope so. Haha. Didn't even mean to do that.
But
ouch. I do try to stay in that kind of hope. Optimism is always like it's a fool's game, and it's quite a complicated word, but um I have a lot of hope in the younger generations that are coming up after us. I do think that I have a lot of hope in humanity in general, that we seem to eventually figure it out. Um, and yeah, I've been really lucky in my life. So even though I have experienced and written through and the tragedies and the trauma, I feel like I've come out okay. And am I just kind of, it's also that midlife kind of really reflecting and relating a lot to, those who came before you, like your parents and your grandparents who, if they were lucky enough to experience midlife, they kind of felt the same way we did in a lot of ways. So
I think as a parent, you kind of have to have hope, even if sometimes that feels like a fool's mission in the face of some of the things in the world.
Yeah.
So speaking of reflecting, I want to thank you for reflecting on Procession with me today, Katherena. It's really a pleasure to talk to you about this book.
Well, thank you so much. It is a pleasure to talk about it and to talk with you today.